All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is May Matcham. I'm the Events and Education Coordinator here at the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust. And I'm excited this evening to share with you this presentation with our friend Kayla from Blazing Star Environmental. We're going to learn a little bit about the Western chorus frog and some of the threats affecting it, as well as some of the work that's being done to help protect this species and help create and manage habitat for it. So I'm just going to start off this evening, as we always do, with a land acknowledgement and with a few slides talking a little bit about the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Just give me 1 second. All right, so thank you for joining us this evening. We'll begin with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have a presence and a deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of what is known to Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Rama, and Beausoleil, and the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog Island, the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We'd like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have been and continue to be subjected to colonial oppression. We acknowledge that the first step to reconciliation is acknowledging Indigenous peoples and their inherent right to the land. We will continue to create a better future for our relationship with Indigenous peoples and the land. The Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy ecosystems that thrive forever. And we recognize that working together with Indigenous peoples to include ecological traditional knowledge systems moves us towards an equitable and sustainable future. So how do we help protect the marine? So the Oak Ridges Moraine is a geographical landform in southern Ontario. It's a big ridge that was formed by the retreat of the glaciers about 13,000 years ago. It extends about 160 kilometers from out by the Niagara Escarpment to the south shore of Rice Lake near Port Hope. So about 90% of that is privately owned. So we work with landowners to help protect important habitats along the moraine. We provide a level of protection that goes beyond legislation. So no matter what changes happen at Queen's Park, we help ensure that those important habitats and the species that depend on them, like the Western chorus frog, will stay protected. So land trusts are a type of charity, a type of nonprofit that either acquires land outright or it acquires interests in land for the purpose of conservation. So people donate land to us. We purchase land sometimes, but a lot of our properties are conservation easements. So somebody might still live on that property or even farm part of it, but part of their property is set aside to be protected in perpetuity. And that's an important consideration. Is all the land that we protect, we're required by law to protect it forever. So we can't change our mind in 10 years and sell it off or decide to put up a condo. We're required under Canadian law to protect all of these places for the rest of time. So how do we help protect the marine? We contribute to the federal government's goal of protecting 30% of land by 2030. We do educational programming like this to help connect people with nature. We support climate change resiliency. Protecting green spaces and biodiversity is a key part of that. And we help protect lands on the marine forever. One of the main mechanisms that we're able to use to help protect land is something called the Ecological Gifts Program, and that's run through the federal government, through the Canada Revenue Agency. And that's a program that provides really amazing tax incentives to landowners who either want to donate or put an easement on environmentally significant land. They get a tax break that's sort of the equivalent of the loss in value of the property. And so it's a really amazing system that works for everybody. It's good for the planet, it's good for land trusts, and it's good for landowners and donors. And another way that we're able to sustain ourselves as an organization and receive new properties to protect is through legacy giving. This really cool project that we've been involved with for the past few years is the Kirtland's Warbler Habitat Restoration Initiative. It's happening right now at two properties in Northumberland near the Ganaraska Forest. So that bird in the picture there is a very endangered bird in Canada called the Kirtland's Warbler. And in the early 1970s, there was only about 200 pairs of these birds left on Earth. They have really specific habitat needs. They only nest in two species of tree. the jack pine and the red pine, but those trees have to be between about 5 and 15 years old for them to nest in them. So any trees that are older than that, they tend not to nest in. And those trees, especially the jack pine, depend on cycles of forest fires to regenerate. And so there's this entire habitat that used to be widespread around the Great Lakes, these sort of oak pine habitats where these Kirtland's warblers used to breed. But with the arrival of European colonizers, the suppression of forest fires, and cultural burns that indigenous peoples used to help maintain these habitats, the populations of Kirtland's warbler plummeted. And so, thankfully, over the past 50 years, there's been some really intense conservation work in Michigan, and they're no longer an endangered species in the US, but they remain very endangered and very rare in Canada. So we're working from scratch to try to build a habitat that will help support these birds and a number of other species at risk. Things like the eastern hognose snake, the red-headed woodpecker, the common nighthawk will all benefit from this project. And over the next few months, there will be opportunities to help volunteer to help support this project. If anybody's interested, in November, we're going to do a shrub planting probably out at this site in Northumberland. We have some other fun events coming up over the next little while. Next month for Pride Month, we're doing a guided walk at our Starcliffe Nature Reserve in Schaumburg, Ontario, a queer ecology hike. And then in July, we have a couple of fun in-person events. We have a guided walk exploring butterflies, dragonflies, and damselflies. And then at the end of July, we have our annual Moth Night. And this is one of my favorite events we do each year. The person leading it is named Andrea Schneider, and she's the national coordinator for National Moth Week for Canada. So a very knowledgeable person, and she's the one who led this event last year. So we're excited to have Andrea back. In a minute, I'll throw some links in the chat for anyone who's interested in learning about volunteering with us or learning about some of these upcoming events or helping to support us. So in just a second here, I'm going to hand everything over to Kayla, but I'm just going to introduce Kayla briefly. So Kayla is an ecologist with over 5 years of experience working in the environmental field. Currently, she works for Blazing Star Environmental, where she manages projects in ecological consulting, restoration, and conservation reach. And Kayla is certainly a big part of the work that Blazing Star is doing with the Western Chorus frog here in Ontario. So I'm going to hand it over to her and we'll get to learn a little bit about this species.
Thanks, May. Just gonna share my screen. Okay, there it is. Alrighty. So I just want to say hello and welcome. So a little bit about this presentation. So at Blazing Star, we have a program that we're currently running called the Western Chorus Frog Friendly Program, which aims to teach best management practices for Western Chorus frog habitat. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the program and the sorts of things that we are teaching folks in our landowner outreach. So my name is Kayla, as May said. I'm an ecologist with Blazing Star Environmental, and I'm the lead coordinator for our Western Chorus frog programming this year. This webinar is designed to introduce folks to the Western Chorus frog, but also help them identify habitat and provide them with best management practices for working within, restoring, and creating said habitat. I'd also like to thank our partners, Environment and Climate Change Canada, who have provided the funding for this program and making it possible. So these are the topics we'll be covering today. I know some of you may have already attended our Western Chorus Frog Volunteer Survey webinar. Some of you may not have. Some of you may know about our Western Chorus Frog programming. But if you haven't, everything will be new. If you have and you have participated in our surveys before, this may be a refresher. But it is important to be able to identify the species and their habitat before moving forward with any of the best management practices that we're going to recommend. So we'll go over that first. Alrighty, so this is the star of the hour, the Western chorus frog. They are a small brown to gray tree frog, actually, and they breed from the end of March to mid-May for about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on your location in the province. There are two populations of this species in the province. One is the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Canadian Shield population, which is listed as threatened federally. And those frogs can be found in both Ontario and Quebec. In the map on the slide here, that's the purple population. And then you have the Carolinian zone population, which is not listed federally, and that is the green zone in the map there. Threats that this species face include climate change, habitat loss and degradation caused by human activity, and invasive species invasion into their small wetlands that they use for breeding. So why are we conserving the Western chorus frogs? Well, Western chorus frogs are frogs, which are amphibians. And amphibians are indicators of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem health, which means that if they disappear, that's typically an indication that there may be something wrong with the habitat. Amphibians can breathe through their skin and tend to absorb things from their environment. They also use habitat that contribute to ecosystem functions, i.e. wetlands, and wetlands are known for being able to retain floodwater, recharging the water table, filtering water, and maintaining biodiversity. And then on top of that, a big shout out to Quebec. They were the first province to use this species as a flagship for species at risk conservation. And they are the reason that we are really here today. A lot of the best management practices that exist for this species come from Quebec and the Quebec team. All right, so first and foremost is determining Western chorus frog presence on your property. You can't ID the habitat or do any of the best management practices if the habitat and the species aren't there. So identifying the Western chorus frog. So first and foremost, as I said, they're a brown to gray tree frog. They're very small, 2.5 centimeters, just little guys. And they have some similarities to other frogs, but you can identify them by the dark spot or stripe between their eyes and the broad dark mask over their eyes, which is a little bit similar to our wood frog. They have a paler white upper lip, and then they have three dark stripes that run along the back, which may be blotchy or broken, and dark broad lines on the side of the body. Now, the call of the Western chorus frog is a mechanical trill that sounds a bit like your thumb running over the teeth of a comb. Just gonna play this for you. Some people say that it sounds a bit like a creaky swing, but I like the thumb over the comb analogy a little bit better. Alrighty, so next we have the spring peeper call, which is the one that you're almost probably familiar with. They're quite loud and you hear them often loudly in the spring in huge choruses. So without further ado, I'll play this. But something about peepers that a lot of people don't know is that they can also do a trill-like call, which can easily be confused for a Western chorus frog. So we've got the Western chorus frog here, that trill. And then we have the peeper trill. So how can we distinguish between the two? Well, the Western chorus frog trill, this one here, is more monotonous or a little bit more monotone, whereas the spring peeper's trill is a little bit more musical. I also find that the peeper trill is a bit higher pitched than the Western chorus frog call, but it can take practice to distinguish between the two. A good rule to follow is that if you hear a peeper trill and then you also hear spring peeper peeps, you're most likely hearing a spring peeper rather than a Western chorus frog. It is very rare that you'll have just one Western chorus frog calling that you can hear in the middle of a bunch of spring peepers. That's always the best bet. Oh, they're gonna play again. There we go. All right. So there are other frogs that might be calling at the same time. So we've got our northern leopard frog, which everyone must be pretty familiar with. Northern leopard frogs have like a low nasal snore and croak. They kind of sound like a growling animal of some kind. And then you have the American toad, whose call is a long monotone trill. And then you have the wood frog, which sounds like a clucking chickens or ducks. There we go. All right, so we're going to move to identifying western chorus frog habitats. Because western chorus frogs live in areas that other frogs are not always living in. So western chorus frogs rely on both aquatic and terrestrial habitats. Their breeding habitat consists of temporary wetlands or shallow portions of permanent ponds where there is an absence or limited presence of aquatic predators like fish. Water in these temporary wetlands accumulates between late fall to spring, but dries up by midsummer. So they do not live in permanent wetlands. The water depth is typically about 11 to 22 centimeters, but it can be as deep as 40 centimeters. Examples of western chorus frog breeding habitats include flooded fields, swamps, drainage ditches, and marshes. Their terrestrial habitat, which is used for foraging and hibernation post-breeding season, is located near the breeding habitat. They don't move very far away. Western chorus frogs tend to have a preference for moist, open habitats, such as humid prairies, moist woods, or meadows. They are often found, especially I've noticed when I'm doing surveys, that if I'm near a farmer's field that has some hay and things growing and there's like a decent little wetland in the middle, they'll be in there. So here's some examples. So we have marshes where we found western chorus frog. We have flooded fields like this. So this is where I found the majority of western chorus frogs calling during my surveys over the last few years. Then we have swamps. And we have shallow wetlands or ponds. And we have drainage ditches, so just right on the side of the road sometimes. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about surveying for western chorus frog. If you want to know more, there is information on our website, and I'm happy to share that with folks afterwards. So when surveying for western chorus frog, you want to be listening for 5 minutes in western chorus frog habitat during suitable conditions in the spring. Survey timing is super important. So it needs to be between the 2 to 3 week western chorus frog calling period between mid-March and mid-May, although that does vary. And each survey should be conducted between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. That is because western chorus frogs are often drowned out by other frogs calling, and other frogs typically call in the evenings. So by conducting your surveys during the day, you're more likely to catch them calling and actually hear them under the racket that the other frogs are making. You want to also be headed out in suitable weather conditions. So the weather should be over 10 degrees, and it should have been that way for a few days. And you want low to no wind, otherwise you won't hear the frogs calling. And you want light to no rain, or else they just won't be calling. So as I said, we have survey protocols and training that are accessible on our website. There's the link there, and I'm happy to put that in the chat for anyone that's interested. You're also welcome to register for western chorus frog survey training. I can forward you all the information on our survey protocol. We have a webinar that's recorded as well. We also request that if you do know of locations of western chorus frog that you might have seen on your walk or wherever, that you submit those to us. We have a form online, and we are always happy to receive those observations. It helps us have a better understanding of the population and where they're found in the province. So you can submit your observations to this webpage, and I can also put that in the chat. I can just link our website, and then you just select projects, go to the Western Chorus Frog main page and submit observations, and there's a whole form to fill out. And we get those right to my inbox. So, all right, so on to Western Chorus Frog best management practices. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about conducting activities within Western Chorus Frog habitat. Activities can mean walking around, it can mean digging, it can mean using heavy machinery. So there's a few key things that you should avoid and things that you should consider. So first and foremost is timing windows. So within Western chorus frog habitat, any of those habitats that we talked about, light maintenance, such as using chainsaws, bow saws, or blade or string trimmers, should be avoided until after August 1st. This This avoids disturbing the sensitive growth period of the juvenile western chorus frogs that move into the terrestrial habitat during this time. Recommend that vegetation control occur in late fall. You want to carry out light vegetation control and habitat cleanup in late fall when vegetation goes dormant so that you aren't disturbing the western chorus frogs as they enter hibernation. And then finally, heavy maintenance or construction should be between the end of fall to the beginning of March, so winter really. This ensures that the western chorus frogs that are sheltering in the leaf litter are not going to be crushed by any machinery, as the frozen ground will support the weight of the vehicles better. Perfect. So this is just a little chart to kind of show you the timing windows. Essentially, western chorus frogs are active from about March until roughly August, July, depending. And so if there is western chorus frog habitat on your property, it is a best management practice to not conduct any sort of work in and around that area during that time. So how do you reduce impacts to western chorus frog habitat? So you want to reduce the activity, as we were saying, in the habitat itself. You also want to ensure that you're preserving natural habitat. So the best way to ensure that western chorus frogs are going to continue to use habitat that you find if you find it on your property is to preserve those natural features they're already using. Restoring habitat is great, but natural already occurring features are better. You also want to avoid pollution near water. This is a big one for all amphibians. As I said before, they breathe through their skin. So if there's any sort of chemicals or anything being used for whatever reason, pesticides, avoid having it near water or near those breeding ponds is essential to ensure the population's persistence on your property. So when we're talking about reducing activity in western chorus frog habitat, you want to limit activity to the smallest possible area. So if you cannot avoid activity entirely in those locations, you should be limiting it. You should prioritize using existing routes. So if there's already a sort of trail through the habitat, taking that rather than making a new one is ideal. And try using the surrounding dry land in the same way as you would the wet, avoiding taking only one path. This reduces the danger of crushing western chorus frogs in the vegetation that they use for shelter. So in terms of preserving existing natural habitat, you want to look at the natural characteristics of the water in the wetlands and known western chorus frog habitat and ensure that that stays that way. That water is essential for their breeding, and they have a very specific kind of hydro period or kind of water and wetland that they're using. And so the changes to that water could mean that that habitat is no longer suitable. The natural vegetation cover should be reestablished if it is disturbed, or better yet, to not disturb it at all. Vegetation is very important for western chorus frogs as they attach their eggs to it in the wetland during breeding season, and then also they move out of it and bury into it during the post-breeding season and into hibernation. It's also important to maintain vegetation corridors between any breeding ponds, as western chorus frogs will disperse somewhat short distances to get to other breeding ponds and find other frogs. And then obviously avoid polluting water. So even bug spray can be detrimental to amphibians. So if you're going out for a walk and there's a lot of insects, and I know right now the mosquito season's really bad, and you spray yourself with some deep bug spray, I would recommend not going in and trying to catch frogs in the pond. It can really impact the amphibians. So I'd also recommend not spreading de-icing salts in the winter if possible near these ponds, as when the ice melts, it will just bring the salt into the ponds and can change the salinity of the water and make it unsuitable. Similar thing, no dumping oil, antifreeze, or household chemicals into storm drains, sewers, sinks, or toilets. That can sometimes find its way into western chorus frog habitat and make that unsuitable as well. Landscaping activities. Everybody loves to get out in the spring and get going with gardening and stuff, but some of those things can be a little bit detrimental. So we're going to talk about reducing activity in regards to landscaping activities and then preserving existing natural habitat as well. So first and foremost, you want to clean equipment and machinery that you're using. So when you're working in areas with invasive plant species or common garden plant species that can be invasive, you want to clean and disinfect all equipment and machinery. Um, and you should be following the OIPC Clean Equipment Guideline protocols, which are listed down below. You can find those. The Ontario Invasive Plant Council has a lot of wonderful resources, and I recommend checking them out if you haven't already. I would also recommend keeping an accessible emergency spill kit if you're using a riding lawnmower or any sort of gas-powered machinery. Keeping one of these on hand in case of accidental oil or chemical spills to ensure that none of that leaks into any of the nearby wetlands. Mowing. So this is a big one. So Western forest frog are almost a grassland species. Not quite. They do choose other habitats, but they sure do love a grassland. And so oftentimes we're super excited to get out there in the spring and be mowing our lawn. But there will be these low-lying patches that are potentially good habitat for Western forest frogs. And we recommend that you raise your mower blades near these occupied areas. You want to avoid mowing depressions where the snowmelt causes water accumulation, and you want to leave some patches of grass unmowed around those areas to serve as a refuge for the Western forest frog. Okay, so agricultural and gardening activities. So these kind of go hand in hand with landscaping. Gardening is a little bit more specific to just the gardens, and then agricultural, talking about larger farming activities. So we want to avoid or reduce pesticide, herbicide, and fertilizer use around these particular ponds. You want to adopt non-intensive agricultural practices near Western coarse frog habitats where possible. You want to consider machinery use and drainage practices as well. So we'll get into it. So avoid or reduce pesticides and herbicides. Why? I've been over it a few times, but they can negatively affect water quality and impact the growth of the Western chorus frog tadpoles and cause deformities. This is true of not just Western chorus frogs, but all amphibians. You can reduce the need for herbicides and pesticides by using non-chemical alternatives for weed control, such as mulching, spading, and hoeing. You can plant native species which are less susceptible to pests and are a little bit more hardy. And then they also provide a lot of food options for other animals. And rotating the plants in your annual garden. So never creating a solid food source for pests to establish themselves. So you don't need to use pesticides. And then you can also grow some naturally repellent plants to keep some of the pests away. And then in terms of fertilizers, so why should we reduce the use of fertilizers? Well, runoff from agricultural fields and from point sources where fertilizers are used a lot can cause an increase in vegetative growth within wetlands and therefore dry out those wetlands, reducing sun exposure and hydro periods, which are both essential things for Western chorus frogs. So you can reduce the need for fertilizers by leaving grass clippings on your lawn after mowing. Just gives that nutrients back into the grass, and using compost to improve soil quality as well. If you do need to use fertilizers, which sometimes it's not possible to avoid this, and that's totally fair, consider the following. Follow the manufacturer's guidelines for calibrating the applicator and choose organic fertilizers, and avoid the application of fertilizers before heavy rain, as this may wash it into nearby watercourses. You should be testing your soil for nutrients before applying excess fertilizer. Perhaps it's not needed at all. And if you can add vegetative buffer strips around Western chorus frog habitat, this will slow runoff from fertilizers and chemicals into those ponds. Okay, and then in terms of agricultural practices, you want to adopt non-intensive agricultural practices near Western chorus frog habitats. Why? Because this enhances habitat connectivity and mitigates the loss of breeding habitat. So those row crops, there is no habitat in those locations, whereas pastures and hayfields will create that habitat for those species. Low intensity, diverse agriculture creates better habitat, and we find the frogs in those sorts of fields often. In terms of machinery, you want to avoid construction activities or farming activities and vehicle use and wetland habitats around and around water systems. And you want to use a vehicle that is in good working order so there's no leaks that might get in to the habitat. And you want to have them be equipped with tracks to prevent soil compaction and ruts, because ruts ultimately can create these sorts of like false wetlands that frogs take up in, and then their tadpoles don't survive. Okay, so in terms of draining practices, you want to allow the natural drainage of water and develop alternatives to constructing irrigation reservoirs where possible. Draining or drawing water and dumping snow or chemical contaminants affects wetlands and can have consequences for the survival of western chorus frog and the preservation of any populations present. Drainage ditches and irrigation channels reduce the hydro period of nearby breeding ponds and should be avoided when in proximity to western chorus frog habitats. If this is not possible, which once again, it might not be possible, sometimes it's just a part of the farming practice, consider creating barriers to prevent the interaction between the irrigation channels and wetlands where possible. And drainage ditches should not connect to predatory fish habitat. Fish love a western chorus frog and western chorus frog tadpoles, and ensuring that those breeding ponds are not connected to fish habitat ensures that there'll be a significant less level of predation for that population. All right, so restoring or enhancing western chorus frog habitat. We're getting into the fun stuff. So when you're looking at improving western chorus frog habitat suitability, we're going to be talking about the wetlands and what you need to be looking at in terms of percentage across the landscape. Same thing with open habitat, and then looking at sun exposure of specific ponds between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., which is the highest point of sun intensity on these ponds, and then looking at how you can improve the habitat if the habitats are fragmented. So if you have a property where wetlands are less than 30% of the landscape and western chorus frogs are present, or there is some habitat on your property and there aren't any frogs present, you can increase the habitat water storage for the property by widening sections of ditches to favor water accumulation, causing them to be a little bit more shallow. You can also favor water retention by limiting surface runoff. So you can block drainage ditches flow with dikes to reroute excess water runoff to accumulation zones, which can be shallow little areas for the frogs to use. If you have, once again, habitat on the property or frogs on the property, and you have open habitat that is less than 40 to 50% of the landscape, which is what is under what is required for western chorus frogs, you can aim to reduce the terrestrial canopy cover and aim for 75% open habitat and sparse forest where possible. Obviously, remember that removing trees sometimes requires permits depending on where you live, so don't just go removing trees willy-nilly, and determine if that's actually what is best for your property before choosing to do this. You can mow open areas in late fall every 3 to 4 years to kind of increase the grass growth. And if the meadow is homogeneous, so there's just one species, you can rotate mowing 1 hectare sections every 4 to 5 years, while keeping 30% of the meadow untreated to allow for a refugia for the frogs. If the pond sun exposure is less than 60% between 10 and 2 p.m., 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., which is the important sun intensity time to help facilitate larval growth, you can follow bylaws and permit or license requirements set up by your municipality to cut down the tree that creates shade over the pond. So once again, don't go to cutting down trees willy-nilly, and make sure this is what's right for your property. But if you think that there's frogs and the pond could use a little bit more sun, this is an option. Also welcome planting small native shrubs and herbaceous wetland species around the perimeter of the pond in lieu of the trees for future control of any successional saplings that may occur. So what happens if western chorus frog habitats are fragmented across the property? There's not a lot of connectivity for whatever reason. You can be planting and widening riparian vegetation buffers along western chorus frog habitat, about 10 to 30 meters in width where possible. You can provide connectivity corridors between habitats, planting herbaceous buffer strips between those wetlands, and you can create wildlife crossings under roads, although this is a very intensive undertaking. So unless you have the ability to do that, it is a bit more difficult. I think putting a frog crossing sign might be a little easier. Um, if a movement corridor between Western coarse frog habitats cannot be created, you can connect two habitats by multiple microhabitats, so creating smaller little wetlands in between rather than a full buffer strip. Or you can increase the surface area of the two separate habitats to make it larger to support a larger population of frogs. So crossing structures to mitigate Western coarse frog road mortalities. So as I said, these sorts of undertakings are intensive and are typically for larger organizations, but these are some things to consider. So a minimum culvert size of 1 meter in diameter for tunnels under 15 meters, and this is for an openness ratio. So when the frogs come into the tunnel, they need to be able to see a light at the end so they can know that they can leave the tunnel at the other end. So the openness ratio ensures that that is possible. Same 1.5 diameter for tunnels of 15 to 25 meters or longer so that those frogs can see that light. Terrestrial tunnels should be used for frogs. I think it would be a little crazy to build an entire frog overpass, although that might be fun. So these tunnels should have high moisture content and have some small pools of water where frogs can seek refuge and rehydrate and wet their skin because that's how they breathe. Tunnels should not be flooded with water. There needs to be places for frogs to stop, especially Western coarse frogs are not very strong swimmers, so having little stop points is important. Open or closed top tunnels may be used, so those are ones with little holes in the top. Open top will improve airflow and moisture levels, but allows for the entry of pollutants and road salts as well, which is not always beneficial. And substrates within the tunnel should consist of soils and litter leaves where possible. Okay, so we'll move on to improving habitat quality. So we're going to talk about best management practices for the following scenarios on your property. There are nearby contamination sources on your property or nearby to your property. Plant cover needs to be reestablished in and around the Western coarse frog habitat, or there are invasive species present. So, nearby water contamination sources. The best way to combat this is to install a vegetated riparian buffer strips to reduce the impact of contamination sources. The buffer strip should be 30 meters to 60 meters wide between the contamination source and the Western coarse frog habitat. So earlier I said 10 meters to 30 meters, but that's just for a basic buffer strip. If there's a contamination source, the larger the buffer, the better. You want to follow the contour lines to redirect the surface flow towards the buffer zone where possible. And ideally, the buffer zone should consist of native species, a mix of both herbaceous species and shrubs to help with erosion and to catch the contaminants. So if there is missing plant cover around Western coarse frog habitat, you can aim for predominantly herbaceous plants and shrubs in a planting. About between 15 to 50% tree or shrub cover is ideal. You don't want anything that's going to grow too tall because you don't want to be shading out that pond. You can also look at terrestrial habitats. So you can aim for a vegetation composition of 75% open habitat and 25% tree and shrub cover. It's ideal to have those trees and shrubs because they create that leaf litter that the frogs like to overwinter in. But you don't want too much because otherwise there's not enough sunlight for them. You can use a mixture of native herbaceous wetland plants or water-tolerant species in and around the riparian zone. It is recommended that you loosen the soil before planting and plant approximately 3,000 seeds per meter squared. You want to manage, control, and remove invasive species within the area. That includes things like Phragmites, buckthorn, and invasive cattails by following the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's OIPC's Best Management Practice Series. So I mentioned them before. They are a wealth of knowledge on everything invasive plants in Ontario, and they have a lot of really great best management practices that I recommend you check out. So, speaking of the three I just mentioned, so the impact of invasive species on these sorts of small ponds that Western coarse frog use. So they spread quickly and outcompete native plants and form dense monocultures. I'm sure you've all seen Phragmites along the road. It's very well known by now. They can form dense vegetative mats that reduce wetland quality and may release chemicals that hinder the growth of other plants or amphibians. So as you can see, the exotic common reed or Phragmites australis subspecies australis pretty easy to identify. We do have a native species, but they're a little bit more sparse and harder to see. So the majority of Phragmites we see now is the invasive. They grow up to 5 meters tall. Invasive stalks are rigid, rough, and dull and tan in color, whereas the native species has a red bottom to their stem. It's pretty indicative. And then the invasives have a hollow stem. Buckthorn. In this case, we've got Rhamnus cathartica, European buckthorn, and then we have Rhamnus frangula, which is the glossy buckthorn, and glossy buckthorn is the wetland invasive. And so you can identify both these shrubs with their smooth, finely toothed leaves arranged in opposing pairs along the stem, and they both produce a cluster of blackberries. Glossy buckthorn has shinier leaves, as its name suggests. And then we have cattail. And so we've got both the native and the invasive listed here. And that is because, so Typha angustifolia is the invasive narrow-leaved cattail, and Typha latifolia is the native cattail. But when left to their own devices with no other native competition, the native cattail can also take over a wetland and dry it out. Quite often. And then sometimes they like to hybridize and become a whole other species. And so when working with cattails and having them in habitats, we want to ensure that there are things that can keep them at bay and stop them from, oh, pardon me, stop them from invading. So they are an aquatic plant, as many of you probably know, that can grow up to 3 feet in height and are recognizable by their downy cigar-shaped seed heads. All right, so the fun stuff as well, creating Western chorus frog habitats. So all activities taking place within these habitats should be done following the guidelines listed in the timing windows section and Table 1 and conducting activities in Western chorus frog habitat section in our BMP document that we have. If you're interested in it, I'm happy to send it to whoever would like it. It is important to keep in mind the breeding, development, and activity periods of the Western chorus frog to avoid causing harm to individuals or disrupting their life cycles. Even if we're making a habitat for them, we still need to be aware that they may be present and we may be disrupting their life cycles with some of the activities. So, requirements for Western chorus frog breeding habitat. So we need to be looking at the location and the landscape of where we're placing this habitat. We need to be looking at the vegetation present and the vegetation planned to be planted. And we need to look at the constructed pond requirements, including the measurements, the substrate, the water, the amount of water, the sun exposure, and the connectivity as well. So locations for Western chorus frog habitat creation must be carefully and strategically chosen, both within the landscape and on a site-specific level. This is to ensure that the habitat characteristics are met, to increase the chances of success of the constructed habitat, and to maximize the conservation value of the project to aid in the overall recovery of the species. Predominance of open habitat in discontinuous forests and wetlands and networks of several ponds with varying layouts and locations are ideal. The optimal landscape for Western chorus frog is about 30% wetlands with mostly open areas and up to 25% wooded areas at most. So we want 75% open, including wetlands. Wetland can be open as long as there's no cover, with no more than 25% wooded areas where possible. A minimum of at least 20% of wetlands. So we'd want to have a minimum 20% more if possible, and primarily composed of temporary wetlands. In terms of vegetation, vegetation within the Western chorus frog habitat should be predominantly consist of herbaceous species and be between 15 to 50% tree or shrub cover. Of that, like 75% or 25% cover from the 75%, 15 to 50% should be trees. There's a lot of percentages being thrown around. Existing vegetation should be diversified for Western chorus frog larval reproduction and development. So we want to have that grass that they attach their eggs to in and around the wetland. And we want to have some trees and shrubs to create that leaf cover for their hibernation. But then we also want some of the herbaceous plants for them to climb up onto when they're juveniles and adults and are foraging. So there's a lot of different levels, and we want to ensure that all of that is available. Additionally, emergent vegetation and submerged vegetation are required for them for shelter as well. And then they can use those for their egg clusters as well. So emergent plants with drooping leaves, like native sedges, are preferred by male western coarse frogs for shelter and for performing vocalization. So they actually hold on to the pieces of grass and scream their little hearts out during the mating season. So. And then western coarse frog breeding ponds should be measuring at least 200 meters squared in the surface area if possible, and should be between about 0.4 to 0.6 meters deep. So as you can see in this picture, this is an ideal example of a western coarse frog breeding habitat. We see how the surrounding area has mainly cattails, and it's all open canopy above the actual pond. We want low slopes and a regular contour with overflow zones to create multiple little mini ponds where possible. And it should also allow for gradient of water temperature, warmer areas, cooler areas where possible. So in terms of constructed western coarse frog breeding pond requirements, the pond should have a hydro period of at least 60 to 100 days, and water quality should be good and distanced from contamination sources. The substrate should enable water retention, and so it should be made of either silt, loam, or clay soils, a mixture to ensure that the water stays during that breeding period, but then is able to evaporate or percolate into the soil post-breeding period. In terms of sun exposure, you want at least 60% of the pond must have sun exposure from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So I've been saying that quite a lot. And then connectivity, so a network of shallow and low flow channels. These frogs are not strong swimmers, so we want to ensure that they're able to actually move between ponds and a channel if there is a channel available. And ensuring that the breeding habitats, once again, do not connect with fish habitat, because that would not be good. So, assessing and selecting sites. You've considered all of these things, and now you're like, how do I choose my site to build my western coarse frog habitat? So you want to look across the landscape for areas that already have favorable features and only a few weaknesses that can be improved, so that you aren't having to do too much work. If you already have western coarse frog habitat on your property, considering building further habitat near to that habitat is ideal. In an ideal world, there's a network of several ponds consisting of varying layouts and locations with at least one breeding habitat every 100 meters, and it should be constructed to offset extreme hydrological conditions. So for instance, if one pond, these hydrological conditions vary from year to year, so if one pond dries up, having a slightly deeper one to ensure that when that year is slightly drier, perhaps that pond in particular will actually be more suitable. So when you're assessing the suitability of the site, you want to examine the topographic features, you want to look at the elevation and the contours, you want to delineate the highest flooding levels of permanent and temporary wetlands, and you want to visit the site immediately after snow melt and again in mid-June to map wetlands, runoff, and flow. You want to document the hydro period and temporal dynamics of the runoff from spring to late summer. You want to identify the flow of the water, the path, peak, and direction where possible. You want to assess the water quality and the existing factors that may impact it within the watershed. And you want to assess the presence of predators and invasive species. So you want to ensure that, once again, it will not connect to fish habitat, and you want to avoid selecting locations with invasive plant species. You want to identify whether the substrate within the selected location enables water retention, as I mentioned before, and you want to assess the surrounding tree canopy to determine the sun exposure of the site. So, assets to a suitable site. So there should be no surface water drainage or catchment present, which could affect the water system of the site. There should be no invasive species present, ideally. It's one less thing to combat if you're already building a habitat and then you also have to remove the invasive species that are already in it. Just a more difficult project. You want limited presence of anthropogenic features where possible, and also limit the presence of nearby annual intensive crops like corn or soy. You want to have limited or no barriers, which could restrict or prevent Western chorus frog movement, such as roads or large water courses, dry environments such as big cornfields, or construction sites or parking lots. And you want a high vegetative cover in buffer zones and a habitat connectivity where possible. So once again, building those ponds near to pre-existing habitat if possible. So once you build build your habitat, that's not it. You want to make sure that it's actually being used by frogs, because there may in fact be something wrong, or there might be something that needs to be changed. It's called adaptive management. As you learn new things, you may need to change how you're doing them. So you want to conduct post-development monitoring during the springtime. You want to monitor the hydro period and water quality, including pH and salinity, to ensure that those are acceptable levels for the frogs. You want to monitor the use of the habitat by surveying for frogs during their calling period. And you want to monitor the vegetation and invasive species and ensure that there is no invasion happening and taking care of those where you can. Alrighty, so that is it from me. I just want to thank all of our sources for this webinar. Without their research and knowledge, this best management practices presentation and the guidelines document that's associated with it would not have been possible. As I said, the Western chorus frog team in Quebec has been working to conserve and steward this species for many years and are a source for a lot of the information contained within this presentation and the BMP document. And these are all of our references in case you feel like having a look at them. And I want to say thank you for attending. If you have any Western chorus frog related questions, I believe there will be a question and answer period after this, but if not, feel free to reach out to info@blazingstar.ca and I will answer that for you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Kayla. That was really wonderful. I think yeah, everyone here, I'm sure, learned a lot about this species. It was really great to be able to go so in depth and learn about their habitat requirements and some of the threats they're facing, as well as things that individual landowners can do to help support them. I think that's fantastic.
No problem.
Like you mentioned, we're going to open it up. If anybody has any questions about the Western chorus frog, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then I can pass those along to Kayla. I did have the opportunity earlier this spring to hear them calling,
Oh, yay.
which is really nice. And it was in very much like sort of a flooded farm field at the side of a country road. So exactly what you're saying, like the typical
Yeah.
sort of habitat.
I found we did a bunch of surveys this spring and that was pretty much every single spot I found them in was sort of just like low-lying grassy. It wasn't always a farmer's field, but it was low-lying and grassy
Yeah.
in like that second photo. I'm gonna put the Blazing Star website in the chat as well for those of you who want to take a look at the Western chorus frog stuff. We do a lot of different outreach and things, but the Western chorus frog page is in there. And there's a lot more information in there if you're interested.
I will also say that of all the frogs in Southern Ontario, they're one of the trickier ones to actually see.
Oh my
Um,
gosh, yeah.
yeah, it's very difficult if you ever, I've only seen them a few times with my eye.
Yeah.
Much easier to hear.
Oh
But
yes,
just
yeah.
like you said, they're often, when I have seen them, they're sort of perched on some
Yeah.
blades of grass or some vegetation.
Yeah, they're super cryptic. I have only seen them once or twice myself.
Mhm.
Most always hear them. I never go really rooting for them, but with this program, we've had a lot of people send photos, which is fun.
Oh,
So I've gotten
wonderful.
some really good Western chorus frog photos.
That's fantastic. I found like even like trying to make a graphic for this webinar, like it was tricky to find like good quality photos of them out there.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. Maybe you answered everything everybody wanted to know.
I guess
Um,
so. There's
yeah,
a
it was a
lot of
great
information
presentation. I
there,
think you
so
did your work very
thanks.
well. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and a big thank you to Kayla once again for leading this webinar. And I hope I see you all at the next presentation and at some of our in-person events coming up over the summer. All
Thank
right.
you,
I'll chat with you
everybody.
all soon.